Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 23. Today we'll be discussing engaging counterarguments. Before we begin, you'll need to grab the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to a document to write on and access to the internet or your Project 3 materials if in your annotated bibliography you identified a counterargument. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the term counterargument. We'll understand the purpose of embedding counterarguments into our own writing, and we'll examine strategies for civilly engaging counterarguments. So, counterarguments. We actually discussed this term very briefly in a previous lecture when we discussed the components of an argument. Now, at the time I said that we would hold off on a more detailed discussion on counterarguments. We are no longer holding off. We are going to have that discussion now. So when we think about a counterargument, we can think of it as a published work or even a widely accepted idea that challenges or contradicts your argument. I've also heard other writers, both professional writers as well as student writers that I've worked with, who have referred to the counterargument as kind of playing the devil's advocate. So bringing up these points that are important to the discussion, but of course challenge our own thoughts and ideas. When we think about what a counterargument represents and what it does, though, it's very important, and while it can be uncomfortable and sometimes difficult to address, you'll want to think that the counterargument, it often represents concerns, questions, or hesitations your audience may have regarding your topic and or your original argument. So for example, if you were to say, hey, let's, pulling from current events, if you were to say, hey, let's book a trip to, let's fly to New York, let's go to New York, and we'll book flights. I'm going to make the argument that we should visit New York and travel there via aircraft. So a counterargument someone might pose to the flying portion might be, but think about all of those Boeing flights that have been grounded and that have crashed recently. So that's a very valid concern or hesitation that your audience might have toward flying. And so it's your job to say, hey, as the writer proposing that we should go to New York via aircraft, it would be your job as the writer to say to your audience, yes, I know that you have these concerns, I know that these hesitations exist, but here is ultimately why my argument still stands and you should still consider it. Extending off of that more, because I often hear writers lament, why do I even have to address the counterargument? Why do I even have to give the counterargument the time of day? And while it may seem counterintuitive to include that in your own writing, it can actually, if you go about it in a smart way, and if you address it correctly, it can make your argument look that much stronger. I mean, think about it this way. If you know that there's really only one major hesitation or concern that your audience holds that would prevent them from accepting and implementing your argument, if you can address that head on, if you can say, listen, I know that this is what you're concerned about, here's why you don't need to be concerned about it, it's going to make your argument appear that much stronger, and it is going to make your audience that much more comfortable in accepting what you have to say if you can dispel any concerns or questions or hesitations they may have. So when we think about embedding counterarguments, again, this can be a very intimidating thing to do for writers at all levels, whether they be, just your everyday blogger to professional writers. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to address your audience's concerns head on. So it gives you the space to say, hey, listen, I know that this is a barrier. Let me show you why this barrier is not as great as my argument. But this also allows you to build your ethos with your audience, because you're saying to them, hey, audience, I understand you. I understand what you're concerned about with my topic. I understand what you're concerned about perhaps with my argument. I completely understand why it's there, but I am going to discuss again why my argument is stronger than this concern, or should kind of trump any concerns that you have. Also, by embedding and discussing a counter-argument in your own original work, it allows you as the writer to approach the counter-argument in your own terms and frame it within your own argument. So if you don't address it, your audience may recall on what the counter-argument says about this and say, oh, well, that's not what so-and-so said, or that's not the popular idea, or this is what's been addressed in the public in the past. And ultimately, what they're doing is they're using the counter-arguments language to assess your own argument. But if you address the counter-argument head-on in your own writing, you have the opportunity to say, listen, this is how it fits within my argument. This is how it dialogues directly with what I'm saying. But you have the upper hand as the writer to approach it in a way that best speaks to your audience and also helps you further your own argument. Finally, what a counter-argument allows you to do is it allows you to demonstrate how your argument fits within the topic's ongoing conversation. So we dedicated a whole assignment to this, a whole project to this with the solution synthesis. So at some point in the solution synthesis, each of you had the opportunity to say, okay, well, based off of what I've read, what I know about the topic, and my own experiences and values, this is how I'm responding to the current ongoing discussion. Well, this allows you in an argumentative piece to take it a step further and say, okay, this isn't just how I'm responding to it, but this is how I myself am entering the discussion through a formal argument. And this is how that formal argument I'm presenting fits within the larger dialogue that your audience will probably be familiar with. When we engage with counter-arguments, we want to make sure that we are engaging with them first and foremost in a civil manner. So we don't want to perceive our counter-arguments as enemy. We want to perceive them as adversary, going back to some of the terms that we discussed when we looked at rhetorical listening, agonism, and civil discourse. So, of course, we want to avoid things like fence-building language. We want to avoid any kind of name-calling. And we really do want to treat the argument and deconstruct the counter-argument in a civil way. Now, what we're about to do is we are about to discuss some a rhetorical structure that allows us to do that allows us to say, hey, I am going to introduce a counter-argument. Here's what they say, here's its shortcomings, and here's how we can circle back to my own argument. So this allows us to address our audience's concerns, say, hey, I hear what you're worried about. Also allows us to say back how we understand our audience's concerns. It also allows us to say, here's why those concerns shouldn't really be a concern, or here's why we should be more critical of the counter-argument. And finally, it allows us to say, here's where my argument addresses those shortcomings, or responds to or corrects those shortcomings I've identified in the counter-argument. The first thing that we'll want to do, though, is we want to begin with a brief transition sentence or even a clause that introduces the counter-argument. So this is a visual signal to our audience to say, hey, I am going to depart from my own original argument. I am going to depart from evidence that directly supports what it is I'm saying, and I'm going to turn my attention to the counter argument that has a loud voice in this discussion, that has an equal voice in this discussion, but that also might get at some of the concerns that my audience might have. So we look at this example here. While I argue for greater student voice regarding the use of student fees on the DSU campus, others suggest that the power should remain with the administration. So what we've done is we've reminded the audience, here's my general, broader overall argument, but here's where I am going to clearly introduce someone who sees otherwise. So if I'm advocating for greater student oversight, the counter argument is advocating for greater administrative oversight. After we have indicated to our audience, our reader, through our language that we're going to turn our attention to a counter argument, we want to provide a brief, objective, and fair summary of the counter argument's rationale. So when we think of rationale, that'll be if it's kind of a more general idea, but if we are citing a specific source or a specific report, then we can just provide a more traditional summary as we've discussed. Now, if we are citing a broader sort of concern, if we're citing a broader concern here, we do want to make sure that we're including at least one specific source. So if we're saying, okay, well, there's a concern regarding how funds are allocated. Maybe that's, just a broader concern. We'll want to make sure that we're introducing at least one source that can speak to that counter argument. Because if not, then it sort of looks like we are just constructing this kind of boogeyman argument to fail. So we just want to make sure that when we are introducing a counter argument that we have a tangible, very real source that we can attach to it. So for example, when we provide a brief, objective, and fair summary, we could say, in a study conducted by the Cal State Colleges Board, the leading authors found that institutions of higher education that allowed administrators to allocate student fees provided greater funding for student-run or student-designed programs. When we look at the language of this, and this is where it can get tricky, especially if you do vehemently disagree with the counter argument, we do want to make sure that we are representing these counter arguments in a very fair way. So that gets back at our discussions regarding civility, but it's also fair to our audience. They should know what others are saying in this discussion without us as writers name calling or fabricating or, sort of distorting what the counter argument actually said. So that's always important, is to make sure that we are representing those who we are engaging with, whether we disagree with them or agree with them, in the way that they're writing and in the way that they intended. The next thing that we'll want to do is we want to civilly but critically engage with the argument itself. A way that we can do that, and I think the best way to do that, is to identify the counter-argument's shortcomings. So what does it not address? Who does it leave out? What makes it irrelevant, or out of date, or unfounded for the particular context we're posing this argument in? So for example, if we're identifying this counter-argument shortcoming, if we're looking at a specific source, the Cal State Colleges Board, that represents a larger view that administrators should have the control over student fees as opposed to the students. So we've presented their view, but again, we want to demonstrate those shortcomings. So we could write something to the effect of, Though the report finds that student organizations receiving administration allocated money saw increases in funding, it omits that the surveyed institutions reduced the number of student organizations by at least 40%. So what we're doing is we're showing how, while the counter argument may be posing this argument that student organizations have greater funding, it doesn't talk about the fact that 40% of student organizations, once this change was made, were cut or removed. And so, yeah, the ones that were kept, sure, they got more funding, but that was because there were 40%, at least 40% of organizations that no longer received funding. So this, perhaps to your audience and perhaps to the integrity of your argument, might be an important point to address with your audience, to say, listen, you know, you may think that if the administration oversees it, that means that more or that there's going to be increased funding. Well, yes, but that also means perhaps that increased funding is going to go to 2 organizations as opposed to 10 or 11 or something along those lines. So you want to also think about, as you are identifying the shortcomings, you might identify several, depending on what it is you're looking at and the counter argument that you're engaging with. But you really, because you're limited to 10 to 12 pages and you don't want your entire project 4 to be kind of nitpicking at the counter argument, you want to identify the one or the few that really speak to your audience's concerns, and you really want to dedicate more time to that, because at this point, it's better to unpack one shortcoming in great detail rather than identify 20 shortcomings and include them in a nondescriptive bulleted list. So, in this case of counter arguments, quality over quantity. All right, so when we think about rounding out our engagement with a counter argument, we want to return to the original argument. So this is kind of like our statement of relevance that we include when we borrow from other sources. Much like when we do that, like if we're quoting someone or if we're paraphrasing or summarizing a source, we always want to come back and say, okay, well, this is why I included it, or this is why it's important to the piece that I have written that you are reading right now. Same thing with counter arguments. Of course, it'll be a little different, but the point is still the same, that you want to circle back to your own original argument. You want to say, this is why these observations are important. This is why I've identified these specific shortcomings. And this is why my argument still holds strong even against the presence of this counter argument. So when we do return to our own original argument, we want to emphasize how our argument effectively responds to the counter argument, to say, okay, well, yes, I've identified this very telling counter argument in my own work, in my own work I've identified it, but this is how my argument is just as strong, that it stands to the counter argument that I've discussed. And then what's also important is to say how your argument accounts for the counter-argument shortcomings. To say, okay, yeah, the counter-argument thinks this, but if we approach it through my way, this is ultimately why it's better, or in the better interest of, whoever your audience is, or whoever your audience is advocating for. So returning to the example, we could say, these findings unfortunately showed that when administrators are solely charged with distributing student fees, they prioritize only a handful of student organizations that often do not accurately reflect the needs and interests of students. If the students, though, had a greater say in the allocation of student fees, all parties could better ensure funding is distributed in a way that represents students' needs. So when we look at it in that way, we have said, Here's the shortcoming that we've identified. Here's why it's important, and here's how my argument accounts for that shortcoming. Here's why my argument not only stands to the counter argument, but also can be seen as superior or the better argument of the two. So now that we have discussed ways to civilly engage with our counter arguments, I would like you to start thinking about what that looks like for your own claim, for your own argument that you want to make in Project 4. So reference your materials from Project 3, the annotated bibliography, if you included a counter argument in that submission. But if you didn't, locate a counter argument using the library database. So it can be any database that we've discussed, or through the mini lectures, or really any database that you find particularly helpful for your specific topic. After you've identified a counter argument, you want to compose a brief write-up, so about 75 words, that engages civilly with that counter argument. Now, in that write-up, you should include a transition in introducing the counter argument, so letting your reader or your audience know, like, hey, I'm switching gears here. You'll want to include a fair and objective summary of the counter argument and citing that one source that you found. And then you'll also want to include a discussion regarding the shortcomings of the counter argument. So where are the holes in the argument that might alleviate or dispel any of the concerns that your audience might have that are represented in that counter argument? And then round out your write-up by returning to your original argument and discussing how your argument accounts for the holes or shortcomings that the counter argument leaves. And so you are more than welcome to use this as a generative writing opportunity if you feel comfortable with the content that you have created during this lecture assignment. Keep it handy and include it in your project for rough draft and final draft. Use it as an opportunity to revise this section over the next few weeks. All right, so for the weekly homework, here's what you'll need to do. You'll need to include the Core Lecture 23 summary and assignment in your Week 12 submission. Overall, in your Week 12 homework submission, you should include the summaries and assignments for Core Lectures 22 and 23, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. That is all due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, March 31st. If you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.